The final topic on the F585 economic syllabus is globalization and development. In this video we will look at development and developing countries, definition and the types of issues that come up, but not in this video the policies that governments might take towards development. On the screen you can see the logo of the Millennium Development Goals, which provide a sort of ready definition, one of the ready definitions of development, and this is developed by the United Nations, and we'll see that the United Nations is quite crucial in promoting the development agenda. So what is development? Development is a country getting better, the quality of life, the standard of living improving. There are various different ways to look at that, but clearly it's more than just economic growth. Economic growth gives people more income on average, but we need to consider things like longevity and literacy, which is certainly the approach that the UN takes with the Human Development Index, which is a standard indicator of development. Modern definitions coming from the UN are a little bit more subtle. They focus on development as the capability to achieve. So a developed country has people who can afford to live and can achieve their aims and enjoy their lives. We'll see how the Millennium Development Goals, as a preview, their little logos are depicted on the side of this screen, track the various aspects with which people could enjoy a free and capable life. I use that word freedom because development as freedom was the approach that Amartya Sen pioneered. Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize in 1998 for his work on development economics, was Master of Trinity College, Cambridge, and teaches at Harvard. What he says is development is expanding your freedom. So things like democracy are hugely important to being a developed country. But in his view, you need the freedom to enjoy a good life, which requires facilities, opportunities, a welfare state, and so forth. So when we think about development, we think about how countries become those successful countries where everyone has a capability and a high standard of living. Development economics wants us to focus as economists on the needs of the poorer countries of the world, understanding that yes, they need to get richer, but also there are other things that need to be focused on for them to enjoy the kind of quality of life that we're used to in the global north. There's some very good software called Gapminder where you can look at the various axes of development. This page here shows you health, GDP, but also size of country by the size of the bubble. If you Google Hans Rosling on BBC4, you could see the video that I've depicted below, or one of his other TED Talks to show Gapminder in action. As we go now to revising the AS topic about whether GDP is a good indicator of standard of living, we can think about what more you need to add to GDP to really understand development, and we can revise the various indicators of standard of living as we go along. So you start off with a measure of output, GDP, and understand that because of the circular flow, it's only a small adjustment to understand that gross domestic product is pretty much the same as gross national income. That is, when you look at it per capita, the average income of people in that country. And as long as you're expressing that adjusted for inflation, i.e. real GNI per capita, in real terms you're looking at the amount of stuff each person can buy on average in a year. So it's quite a good indicator already of standard of living. That's pretty similar to just saying GDP, but of course strictly you're looking at real GNI per capita as your sort of GDP measure of national income. Once we've managed to get real average income from GDP, Does that make it a good indicator of development? Well, the first thing to remember, a technicality really, is that when comparing countries, you have to look at it at PPP, that's purchasing power parity exchange rates, because the cost of living in some countries is very different from others. But once you've made the adjustment at PPP, what you're saying is that the figure you've adjusted it to can buy you the same amount of stuff in each country. The other thing about GDP statistics is that they don't include those things which are unreported. That's often illegal activities, the unreported economy itself, the shadow economy, and all the non-market activities such as DIY or family work and so on. And this is an important one for the issue of development, because in many developing countries there's lots of non-marketed activity. Family, community, village, tribe can provide a lot of welfare which is not marketed, not monetized, so we would never capture that in a measure of GDP. So sometimes the figures we have for the income of people in poor countries underestimates the welfare because they manage to get by with non-monetized things. A really, really important issue, and this will come up as we talk about globalization and all aspects of the macroeconomy, is the issue of distribution of income. And you have to remember that when you get a figure of GDP per capita, you're looking at the average income. But it doesn't show you what each person gets. And if there's a very, very big gap between rich and poor, even if there's a high average, there may be very, very many people who have very terrible or very poor quality of life. So what you have to understand is that inequality means that we have to be very cautious about seeing GDP growth as development. If GDP, and this is the crucial point here as we look at the economy as it stands now, with modern China and modern India and the Asian tiger economies, is that just because GDP per capita is growing very, very fast, that does not necessarily mean that the vast majority of people are benefiting. It may well be that the rich are getting very, very rich indeed with growth, which is bringing up the average, but not the standard of living for most people. GDP figures will not include the value of leisure time, probably more of an issue for very developed countries as opposed to developing countries, and they don't include social indicators such as health, food intake, doctor-patient ratios, access to the internet, access to clean water, freedom, and all these things. Now, most development indexes try to include some or all of these things, because to have a capable life, to be truly free, development is freedom, remember, you need to be able to live and be free politically, to learn and to be healthy and bring up children. And the final issue here, as a problem of GDP, and particularly the growth of GDP as an indicator of development, is the question about whether our economic growth is sustainable. And this is something that requires quite a lot of thought, and the syllabus gives quite a lot of emphasis to. We'll say a little bit more later on about sustainability, but as far as GDP goes, remember that it measures the value of output, but some of that output might have very severe environmental externalities. They might even outweigh the value itself, so they're economic bads. So the first level of economic understanding you need to have is that GDP may not capture welfare because it includes negative environmental externalities. The second level is the level of the dynamic level, the level of growth. At GDP growth might grow faster than the ability of natural resources to replenish themselves. So what you have there is a lack of sustainability, that we are growing, using up natural resources faster than they replenish themselves. This cannot go on forever, proving that our growth is not sustainable. So we can begin to look at the indicators used to show development. The most commonly used measure is the Human Development Index, which has been used by the UN for quite some time. It was invented by our friend Amartya Sen, and it's been measured slightly differently since 2010 as a geometric mean of 3 indices, or indexes I should probably say. Those indexes are one for life expectancy, one for education or literacy, which is mean years in schooling and expected years in schooling, and one income index, which is a measure of, based on gross national income. So what you have with HDI is a GDP plus life expectancy and literacy measure. And although that is the headline measure, the UN added inequality to their measures to give you the IHDI in 2010, and they also produce a gender inequality index, which highlights how women and girls very often have very much less freedom and very much less quality of life than men in many countries of the world. Theoretical economists would like to look at net welfare, net benefit, rather than just output, taking into account externalities and unmeasured elements of consumer surplus and so on. That would be the measure of economic welfare. And that's not really taken off, but an index of sustainable economic welfare using a similar methodology which accounts for environmental externalities has been developed. This is very important when we consider that we're really interested in sustainable development. Development that also respects the environment. So, GDP, and by extension growth, are not sufficient to say that a country is developing. We need to add in social indicators such as literacy and health, and we need to subtract environmental externalities. There are a few other things to think about, but those 2 key points, one, that money is not everything and that there's more to development than growth, and the other, that it needs to be sustainable, are the most important. You don't need to remember all the different indexes, but you must understand how HDI is calculated. You must understand the idea of an index of sustainable economic welfare, and you must consider different ways in which gender inequality and other issues are possibly included into these kind of measures. A huge issue within development economics is the issue of sustainability. It's so important that very often we talk about needing sustainable development, that is, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. There are various ways in which economic growth and development can be unsustainable. One of the most obvious and important ones is CO2 emissions causing man-made climate change. It's quite possible that if the economy grows and doesn't reduce its carbon intensity, then there'll be a catastrophic effect through global warming. There are also other externalities from economic activity, such as local and global pollution, and congestion and loss of amenity value, that is, the enjoyment of the environment around us. One thing to consider is the really dangerous prospect of China and India growing at the rate that they are in a highly industrialized way, meaning that emissions and pollution increase massively. Already we see that China has some of the world's most polluted cities. They're damaging their own rivers, never mind the ever-increasing amount of CO2 emissions. Set against that is the hypocrisy of the West trying to prevent countries in the developing world trying to get rich in the same way as they did, that is through industrialization. So we look at the economic theory of externalities, we look at the issue of growth, we look at the issue of finite resources, and we consider the market failure of a public good with global warming when we look at this topic. One of the ways in which to think about development is the Millennium Development Goals, which were set in 2000, obviously, by the UN as the main areas in which we could focus our thinking towards development in the world. This gives us a very good way, in essays and in answering questions on the exam, a very good framework to think about how much progress there has been towards development in the last 15 years, which kind of things you might include when thinking about development, and a source of recent statistics, because the aim was that these Millennium Development Goals would be achieved by this year, 2015. The UN is going to go on now to sustainable goals, so you might well want to look at the UN website or the Guardian page here, linked to here, in order to look at the Sustainable Development Goals from 2015 onwards. So what are the Millennium Development Goals? Well, first, eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. And this is probably the Millennium Development Goal which has been achieved most successfully. Between 1990 and 2010, the rate of people living on less than $1.25 a day has more than halved. So that's success in the first Millennium Development Goal. Although there is stuff in the extract in the F585 exam specifically relating to this Millennium Development Goal and questioning the figures. The second one is achieving universal primary education. Again, there's been some gains, substantial gains in reaching that, and also achieving gender parity in primary education, which is part of the goal. Gender equality itself and empowering women is another one of the Millennium Development Goals, and it's one of those vectors that you could talk about when you talk about measuring development as opposed to just growth. Reducing child mortality is the fourth Millennium Development Goal. The UN says that improving maternal health hasn't been met very well, that they've gone quite some way to combating HIV/AIDS, and they have significant success, and that they will probably meet their goals with malaria and other diseases. Environmental sustainability is something that they are going to push further after 2015, and developing a global partnership for development is difficult to measure and rather a woolly goal, really, but they feel that there is certainly a lot of agreement now on the development agenda. So the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, need to be learnt for this exam and used as examples and definitions of how we can make progress with development. So what is a developing country? A developing country, or less developed country, LDC or LEDC, is basically most of the global south. These countries are all the regions of Africa, most of Asia, apart from Japan, most of Latin America and the Caribbean. On the other hand, those more developed countries, or OECD countries, are focused in the global north. They are Europe, the United States of America and Canada, but also Japan, South Korea and Australasia. It's worth remembering that there are some very, very powerful countries who are not in the OECD, such as Russia, China, India, Brazil. They have plenty of characteristics of developed countries. They're certainly very powerful overall, but their per capita GDP is still pretty small. Newly industrialized countries are often considered the Asian tigers, as long as the transition economies, the ones that have moved from communism to capitalism and are now growing very fast, joining the world of capitalist trade. Clearly the big story of the last 30 years is the bringing of the communist world and the hermit kingdoms of the East into the global trading system, global capitalism, and with that very fast rates of growth. So what are the characteristics of developing countries? Well, the main thing we look at is large numbers of absolute poverty, low levels of GDP per capita. But alongside that, by definition really, we see low levels of other development characteristics, such as there being poor health outcomes, low political freedom, poor outcomes with education, and so on. It's not always true that the poorest countries are the least developed. Some poorer countries have a higher standard of living and better outcomes, and the HDI can help us tease out which ones are they. The other thing that you typically see in developing countries is that they have very high levels of population growth, which strains their ability to spread income around in a good way, and also a high degree of reliance on primary industry. The high dependence on the primary sector could be an important question to discuss in the exam. On the one side, you can see that the logic of comparative advantage would suggest that a developing country would specialise in primaries, that is agricultural products and mining, extractive industries like that. This is because of the Heckscher-Ohlin thesis, which is that countries will specialise in those producing those goods in which they have an abundant factor of production. Many developing countries, the countries of the global south, have abundant land and possibly abundant cheap labour, but very little capital, which means that they're not really that well suited to manufacturing yet, and they have very little human capital, which means they're not so well suited to services. So on the one hand, we can see that if you have a comparative advantage, it makes sense to specialise in the production of that good and import others. But there are problems with that. One is the problem of over-specialisation, particularly as we understand that primary products are determined in global markets by perfect competition, and so their price is not something that can be controlled by the producers individually. And because both supply and demand are inelastic and subject to variation according to weather, crop disease, discovery, things like that, prices can be very volatile. This can cause terrible risks for the people in those countries that are over-specialised. Another interesting idea to do with over-specialisation is Dutch disease, also known as the natural resource curse. In this model, a country which is blessed, it seems, with a very valuable natural resource, let's say Nigeria with oil, will find that exporting that valuable product will push up its exchange rate. This will make it impossible for that country to export almost anything else. The logic of over-specialisation then takes over, and all the other industries in that country wither. The reduced reliance on undynamic industry argument for protection, elsewhere in the notes, simply says, although not simply put, I admit, that primary products don't promote technology, technique, innovation, learning by doing, skill, all those things we think improve technology and productivity. In other words, if you continue working on what you're good at as a developing country, which is very basic primaries, you're never going to get good at those things which promote growth, which are high tech and get you growing very fast. The other problem of the dependence on the primary sector is it causes a divide between countries and cities, lots of displacement and migration can occur. These are more characteristics of developing countries than a particular problem with the primary sector. Developing countries are characterised by having a large shadow economy or informal sector of their economy. Now, on the one hand, we must remember that that's providing a lot of welfare which is not measured in our GDP calculations. But also, because quite a lot of economic activity is unreported and unregulated, it can be an opportunity for criminals and bandits to seize control and generally be extractive rather than working to the mutual benefit, which happens in a structured and regulated market. You might also argue that governments need tax revenues for infrastructure, and one of the problems in countries which don't have a good rule of law is that tax tends to fall on the weakest because they're the ones least equipped to exploit all the tricks of a poorly regulated country. This is part and parcel of a crucial point about development, which is that good institutions are required for a country to develop. It needs the rule of law, good courts, good police, all these things which stop corruption, and all these things that make free markets work. Curiously, free markets work best with a little bit of regulation, making sure that contracts are honoured and that people act fairly and squarely. So that is a run-through of the issues of development. We need now to examine policies towards development and theories of growth in a second video. One final and passing thought before we stop is that I think that we can go too far in thinking that development economics and classical economics are very, very different. When we talk about development economics, we're talking about poor countries having an opportunity to grow richer and develop sustainably. Many of those things which support that are the things we talk about as being good for the macro objectives of any country. They are about having good supply side policies and a thriving market system, but also the correction of externalities and government intervention where required.